Let me turn to our foreign and security policy practitioners and ask them to make a few remarks on the subject, and then I hope that it will provoke more thoughts for that further discussion. Giga, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this event, commemorating one of the greatest days of the 20th century, the fall of the Soviet Union. I would like to welcome all the guests and especially President Landsbergis, whose presence in Tbilisi is always an honor and pleasure for all of us. And there was a very in-depth discussion about the challenges in the future, but I want to start with a more simple but positive note, which I already mentioned. Partly, I'm sure some other speakers spoke about it, but I can't resist not touching upon it, that really the great days are coming. I mean, the anniversary, there is no exact date of which can be considered as a consensus of fall of Soviet Union. I think the dispute is 23rd or 25th. I think the most appropriate date is 25th, when Gorbachev stepped down. But in any case, I think we should all, let's say so, remember happily these great days, because this 20 years overall has been huge success. I think we look around and we watch our friends from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and other Eastern European countries, Poles, Czechs, and I mean, this is the big success. I mean, the world is much better off than it was 20 years ago. I think it's very hard to argue with that. I think all of those nations are now free, prosperous, and much more protected sovereign states. People are freer, people live better. Even we, Georgians, Moldovans, Ukrainians, and others who have not made it yet where we belong, meaning in a club of free nations in Europe, in NATO and Euro-Atlantic community, even we have our sovereign states. We're independent countries. We are, with many external and some internal obstacles, building our liberal democracies and moving ahead. Even the most dire critics of either Georgian domestic development or any other would hardly argue with that. So I think it's a great success overall. Now, there was a lot of talk about challenges here, and I will not go as deep as Mr. Darcheshvili went, and by the way, I do confirm that he was speaking on his personal behalf. But there is really a challenge, we all understand. Europe whole and free, which was a very important slogan, now it is not fulfilled. There are still nations in Europe which have an existential external threat for their sovereignty and existence, and Georgia is one of those, probably at the forefront of it, and we are not happy about it at all. There is no romantic heroism in that. We'd rather be building in a dull situation, normal institutions, and building liberal democracy. But it's not the case, and until it's not the case, the job is not done. So listening to what Mr. Peterson was saying, and a very interesting presentation, I think that tendency, which I hope will not fully materialize, with all respect, but I do acknowledge that there is more than a merit in that perspective, is very dangerous, because if this project is not continuing, and if this process of freeing the captive nations fully and is entrenching liberty, liberal democracy in the whole continent is not finished, there will always be a danger of a reverse process. Maybe not very quick, maybe not immediately devastating, but it's inevitable that it will happen. And I'm not saying that only because a few weeks ago the quote-unquote new idea of Eurasian Union was voiced. We all know that unfortunately for all of us, our northern neighbor, the whole political elite of our northern neighbor, current one, have not accepted fully the fact of dissolution of Soviet Union, and in one way or another have always attempted or planned to rebuild in various forms the sphere of influence, which, if accepted once, if accepted at some border, the concept of sphere of influence, then it can be enlarged. So obviously we here in Georgia do have our own national interest to protect our sovereignty. But I would dare to argue that even from cynical or pragmatic point of view, for Europe, allowing that concept to exist somewhere in Europe, even at the margins of Europe from their perspective, is very dangerous. It's pragmatically dangerous. And he was a very interesting question asked here, how we should support Russian democracy, because Russian democracy is in the interest of the whole Europe because of the security reasons. And I'm not even mentioning the Russian people's legitimate right to be free. I think one of the best ways, not the only way, but one of the best ways of promoting changes inside Russia is supporting the nations around Russia. Those nations who clearly chose to become liberal democracies, like Georgia is, whatever our critics say, and like Moldova is and others are, whatever our current domestic obstacles or backslidings, as anybody can name them. But success of countries like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine has direct impact on situation in Russia. I think there is one famous in Tbilisi's political circle story of one very well-known diplomat, Western diplomat, who did recall when he was moving from Moscow in mid-90s to one of the Baltic states, and he had a reception attended by high-ranking Russian officials. And one of those officials in good relationship with him, after a couple of shots of alcohol, did tell him, well, Mr. X, good luck, wish you all the best in those Baltic countries. They were never ours, so they will go west, we accept it. But Georgia and Ukraine, it's Russia. And so in that sense, the Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians have been a great inspiration for us here in Georgia, watching how they managed to rebuild their independence and freedom when Georgia was in the middle of the civil war, and they are staying as inspiration for us of success. But I think for Russian political elite, it's much more sensitive what happens in Georgia and Ukraine for emotional and ideological reasons. Because if you would follow Mr. Lavrov's recent interview in Kommersant, it was I think 7 or 8 months ago, he was very honest and explicit. He said that there is one spiritual space of CIS countries. It's one cultural and spiritual space. And there are outsiders who are trying to penetrate it. And then there is one anomaly, which is Georgian government. He said that. I'm not complaining. I take it as a compliment from Mr. Lavrov, but it really shows that the example of success, relative success, in countries which are psychologically, from political point of view, considered in Moscow to be part of the same organism, for right or wrong, for wrong from my point of view, will influence the situation inside Russia. Again, I don't have illusions that it will be immediate breakthrough because of that, but I think it's key part of maintaining European security, of having some kind of belt of democracies around Russia. So I think, other than our national interest, there is genuine, pragmatic European interest in supporting Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and supporting Eastern dimension. There was such an interesting presentation, I don't want to take too much of your time. Just one point what Mr. Dachiashvili mentioned, and why I so eagerly agreed with him that he was speaking on his personal behalf, was that this notion of security versus democracy and liberal democracy thing. I fully take on board that the cliche phrase is that Georgia's best security, or only security, is its building its democracy. Well, should not be taken literally. I mean, we all understand that security is not only having democratic institutions, but it has some very concrete, feasible aspects. So it shouldn't be an excuse to overlook the real challenges that we have, either for us, first of all for us, or for our allies. It should not become that excuse. But on the other hand, I don't believe that there is any entrenched conflict between those issues. Based on my experience, I'm not theorizing, I'm not academic, I'm talking about our reality. I think it's obvious that democracies have some weaknesses which can be exploited, but overall, our limited or my limited experience shows that Georgia survived and will survive further, partly because it was overall democracy. Whatever our critics say, it is on the way of becoming full-fledged liberal democracy. Maybe some are unhappy with the pace, but basically it's democracy. And we would have not survived in our recent years if it wouldn't have been that way. So I think when I speak about coming challenges, and I think there are challenges which Georgia at least individually cannot affect. It will be how the Euro-Atlantic world will develop, what will be the path shown. Will the tendency which Mr. Patterson described really materialize in a dramatic way in that sense, which will be a very dangerous development. And I don't want to drive historic parallels, but whenever there were moments when US withdrew in 20th century from European stage, it did not end well for anybody. And again, I'm sure history will not repeat itself in that way. There are no preconditions for that. But just saying that Russia is a waning power so we can ignore the threat which is coming, I think it's just amateur. I'm not even moralizing that it's against moral values. It is, by the way, but it's another case when pragmatic interests and political values and fundamental values do coincide fully, and that's how we should look at that. Meanwhile, until we are not at an easy juncture, I think Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, or others should continue to take care as much as it's possible about their security by being high on the profile of the world, by making it politically harder to be hurt by its northern neighbor, and at the same time continue to build its institutions in liberal democracy. It's not easy, but it's doable. It's more than doable. And I said once a few weeks ago at one of my speeches, and I would say, whenever we feel that times are not good and tendencies are not good, we should always compare our situation with 1921, and it always feels better, much better. So we are better off now, and it will continue like that, I'm sure. But it won't be an easy ride. It was not an easy ride 20 or 30 years ago. And last, not least comment, when we're speaking about engagement with Russia, I think it's obvious, it makes sense for our European allies to engage with big neighbor. It's pragmatic, it's completely understandable. It just should not be driven by illusion that just an engagement or accepting somebody to the club by itself does the trick. I do remember one international organization, very important for Georgia at the time, even now to a certain degree. I will invoke personally Chatham House rule and to tell this story, which did have a debate whether to accept Russia or not. And I do remember the famous quote by one of the important players that we must accept them, so then we'll change their behavior. Now, I think over 15 years have passed after that, but what I can confirm, based on my personal experience, and some of the colleagues here from the parliament do have their own experience of that, they have hardly changed Russia. But what happened is that the Russian presence, their infiltration, virtual and concrete, have changed this organization and undermined it completely. I think everybody understands what I'm talking about, which European organization. And that's the lesson to be learned, that if engagement is done not based on some principles and sober assessment of the situation, and pragmatic, it's the combination of it, it might not end well. But I'm sure that it will not happen like that. There will be some deviations from the course, but overall, as Mr. Patterson said, the Euro-Atlantic unity has no alternative, even if the emphasis shifts to different degrees, at least at this stage. And Georgia will, and Moldova and Ukraine and all others will go the way which our people have chosen, which is destined for us. And with more or less trouble, this journey of Europe whole and free, which had a great day 20 years ago, will continue to its very end. So thank you, and sorry for very widespread amplitude of my points, but I really want to use the opportunity and congratulate you all on this big anniversary which is coming. Thank you.